The Letter from the Old West.
"All I have is this letter and a cross in the desert," said the nameless girl. The dust cloud appeared on the horizon like a prayer whispered against the merciless Arizona sky. Sheriff Thomas McKenna squinted from the porch of his weathered office, watching the lone rider approach Redemption Ridge. The figure was small, swaying in the saddle of a weary horse that had seen too many miles under the scorching sun. As the rider drew closer, McKenna's weathered face creased with surprise. It was a young woman, no more than 20, with auburn hair escaping from beneath a worn hat. Her dress had once been blue, but now carried the stains of a long journey across unforgiving terrain. She dismounted with the careful movements of someone who had learned to hide pain. The woman reached into her saddlebag and withdrew 2 items: a faded letter sealed with wax that had long since cracked, and a wooden cross carved with delicate precision. Her fingers trembled as she held them, as if these simple objects contained the weight of her entire world. The townspeople who had gathered to watch her arrival stepped back instinctively. "I'm looking for someone," she said, her voice carrying across the silent street like wind through empty buildings. Someone connected to the name Hope Annabelle Carter. The silence that followed was so complete that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Several townspeople exchanged glances, filled with something that looked like fear. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, the town's most prominent widow, clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her face had gone pale, and she whispered something to the woman beside her before hurrying away. The young stranger noticed every flinch, every averted gaze, every step backward taken by people who suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. McKenna approached cautiously, his boots echoing against the wooden boardwalk. "Miss, that name... It hasn't been spoken in these parts for near 15 years. His voice carried a warning, gentle but firm. "Maybe you'd best tell us who you are, and what brings you to Redemption Ridge with questions about the past." The woman straightened her shoulders, though her hands still shook as she held the letter and cross. "My name..." She paused, swallowing hard. "I don't rightly know my name. All I have is this letter and a cross in the desert. The letter mentions this town and Hope Annabelle Carter. I've come 300 miles to find answers." Father Miguel emerged from the small chapel at the end of the street, his brown robes dusty from the morning's work. His eyes fell upon the wooden cross in the woman's hands, and his face went ashen. He crossed himself quickly and began walking toward them, his steps deliberate despite his obvious reluctance. "Child," Father Miguel said softly, "that cross, where did you come by such a thing?" His accent carried the musical cadence of his native Mexico, but his words were heavy with concern. The craftsmanship of the cross was unmistakable to him, carved by hands he remembered, blessed by prayers he had once spoken. The young woman looked from the sheriff to the priest, sensing undercurrents she couldn't understand. "A dying woman gave it to me. She said it belonged to Hope Annabelle Carter, and that I should bring it home." She paused, looking around at the faces that refused to meet her eyes. "This letter is the only clue I have to who I might be." The cemetery lay just beyond the edge of town, marked by a simple wooden fence and an iron gate that creaked in the desert wind. As if drawn by an invisible force, the young woman walked toward it, leaving the townspeople standing in uncomfortable silence. Her feet seemed to know the path, though she had never walked it before. Among the weathered headstones, one bore the name she sought: Hope Annabelle Carter, beloved daughter, 1850-1872. Standing before Hope Annabelle Carter's grave, the young woman's hands trembled as she broke the ancient wax seal. The letter crackled like autumn leaves as she unfolded it, revealing words written in fading brown ink. Her voice shook as she read the first lines aloud to the silent tombstone. "My dearest daughter, if you are reading this, then I have found the courage to tell you the truth I have carried for 20 years. Father Miguel had followed her to the cemetery, his footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path. He stood at a respectful distance, but close enough to hear her voice carry across the desert air. The words she spoke seemed to reach into his chest and squeeze his heart with a grip he hadn't felt since the day they buried Hope Annabelle Carter. The letter continued in the woman's quavering voice. Your mother was not the woman who raised you. Hope Annabelle Carter died giving birth to you in the winter of 1872, and with her last breath, she made me promise to keep you safe from the truth that could destroy you. The young woman's legs gave way, and she sank to her knees beside the grave. Sheriff McKenna approached slowly, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, not from fear of the woman, but from the memories her words were stirring. He had been a young deputy when Hope Annabelle Carter died, and he remembered the circumstances that the town had agreed never to speak of again. Some secrets, he had learned, were buried for good reason. The woman looked up from the letter, her eyes bright with unshed tears. The letter is signed Elena Vasquez, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She says she was Hope's friend, and that she took me away from this place to protect me from something terrible. Her fingers traced the carved letters on the headstone with a reverent touch. Father Miguel stepped closer, his face etched with internal struggle. Elena Vasquez, he repeated slowly. I remember her. She worked at the saloon, but she was a good woman despite what people said. She left town suddenly one winter night, and no one ever saw her again. His voice carried the weight of confession. Behind them, unnoticed by the small group at the cemetery, several townspeople had gathered at the edge of the graveyard. Mrs. Whitfield stood among them, her face a mask of barely controlled panic. She whispered urgently to the men beside her, and they nodded with grim understanding. The past was threatening to surface, and they were not prepared for the consequences. The young woman rose to her feet, still clutching the letter and the wooden cross. Eleanor raised me in a small cabin near Tucson. She never told me about my real mother until she was dying last month. She said I needed to come here, to Redemption Ridge, to learn who I really am. Her voice grew stronger with each word, as if speaking the truth was giving her courage. The wind picked up, swirling dust around the cemetery and rustling the pages of the letter in her hands. The remaining words seemed to dance before her eyes, promising answers that both terrified and compelled her. She knew that once she read the rest of Elena's confession, there would be no returning to the simple life she had known. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the graveyard, the young woman made a decision that would change everything. She would read the entire letter, regardless of what secrets it revealed. She would stand in this place where her real mother was buried and finally learn the truth about who she was and why she had been hidden away from the world. The Dusty Rose Saloon had seen better days, its paint peeling like old skin and its bat-wing doors hanging askew on rusted hinges. But it was the only place in Redemption Ridge where secrets flowed as freely as the whiskey, and the young woman sensed that answers might be found among its shadowed corners and hushed conversations. She pushed through the doors as the evening crowd began to gather, men with weathered faces and women with knowing eyes who all fell silent when she entered. The letter remained folded in her hand, but the wooden cross hung visibly around her neck, catching the flickering light of oil lamps and causing more than one patron to cross themselves quickly. The bartender, a heavy-set man named Jonas Pike, polished glasses with mechanical precision while studying the newcomer. His movements were deliberate and controlled, but his eyes betrayed a nervousness that hadn't been there an hour ago. Word traveled fast in a town like Redemption Ridge, and everyone already knew about the woman asking questions about Hope Annabelle Carter. I'll take a glass of water, the young woman said, her voice steady despite the hostile atmosphere. And maybe some information about a woman named Elena Vasquez who used to work here. The silence that followed was so profound that she could hear the distant howl of coyotes beginning their nightly chorus. A woman emerged from the back room, her hair silver white, but her posture straight and proud. Ruby Martinez had owned the Dusty Rose for 30 years, and her eyes held depths that spoke of countless secrets kept and stories untold. She studied the young woman with an intensity that seemed to look straight through to her soul. Elena Vasquez, Ruby said slowly, each word measured and careful. Now there's a name I haven't heard spoken aloud in many years. She moved behind the bar with the grace of someone who had navigated this space for decades, her fingers drumming thoughtfully against the worn wood surface. The young woman stepped closer to the bar, her heart racing. You knew her? She raised me, but she never told me much about her life here, only that she had to leave suddenly one winter night in 1872. She placed the letter on the bar between them, a silent offering of trust. Ruby's eyes fixed on the letter, and for a moment something like pain flickered across her features. Eleanor was my friend, she said quietly. One of the few decent people in this God-forsaken place. But she got mixed up in something bigger than herself, something that cost this town more than it could bear to remember. From a corner table, an old cowboy named Dutch Morrison cleared his throat. He had been listening to every word, his gnarled hands wrapped around a half-empty bottle of rye whiskey. "That girl's asking about things that are better left buried," he said, his voice carrying across the silent saloon like a warning. Ruby shot Dutch a look that could have cut glass, but he continued anyway. "Elena took something that night she left," he said, his eyes never leaving the young woman's face. "Something that belonged to this town, and some folks never forgave her for it." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, heavy and ominous. The young woman felt the weight of every gaze in the saloon, some curious, others hostile, all of them hiding knowledge she desperately needed. She picked up the letter from the bar and held it against her chest, like a shield. "Elena saved me," she said firmly. "Whatever she took to protect me, and I'm going to find out why." Father Miguel had not slept well since the young woman's arrival. He sat in his small room behind the chapel, staring at a leather-bound journal he hadn't opened in 15 years. The journal contained records of every birth, death, and marriage in Redemption Ridge, but it also held secrets that had haunted him since he first put pen to paper in 1872. The morning sun streamed through the chapel's stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the rough wooden pews. Father Miguel heard footsteps approaching and looked up to see the young woman entering, her wooden cross catching the light like a beacon. She moved with the reverent steps of someone seeking sanctuary. "Father," she said, her voice echoing in the small space. "I need to ask you about the winter of 1872, about Hope Annabel Carter and what really happened when she died." She sat in the front pew, her hands folded around the letter that had become her constant companion. Father Miguel closed his eyes and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 15 years of silence pressing down upon him. "Child," he said, slowly, "some confessions are too heavy for one soul to bear alone. What you're asking, it involves the whole town and wounds that have never properly healed." The priest moved to sit beside her, his weathered hands clasped tightly together. "Hope Annabel Carter was not just any young woman," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was the daughter of Judge Marcus Carter, the most powerful man in the territory, and the circumstances of her death meant they were not what the official records state." The young woman turned to face him fully, her eyes wide with anticipation and fear. "Elena's letter mentions something terrible that I needed to be protected from. Was it my father? Was he someone who couldn't acknowledge me?" Her voice trembled with the weight of questions that had tormented her entire journey to Redemption Ridge. Father Miguel stood and walked to the altar, where a simple wooden cross hung above a table covered with white cloth. "Your father," he said, his back still turned to her, "was indeed someone who could not acknowledge you, but not for the reasons you might think." He turned around, his face etched with the burden of truth. "Hope fell in love with a married man," Father Miguel continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "A man with a wife and children in another town, a man whose reputation and standing in the community would have been destroyed if the truth came out. When Hope died in childbirth, he wanted nothing to do with you." The young woman felt the walls of the chapel closing in around her. "Who was he?" she whispered, though part of her feared the answer. The letter crinkled in her hands as her grip tightened, and she wondered if Elena's words would confirm what the priest was telling her. Father Miguel returned to sit beside her, his eyes filled with compassion and regret. "His name was William Hutchinson," he said softly. "He was a businessman who came through Redemption Ridge regularly, selling supplies to the mines. He promised Hope he would leave his wife for her, but when she died..." He shook his head sadly. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. filled with the weight of tragedy and abandonment. The young woman stared at the colored light streaming through the windows, trying to process the magnitude of what she had learned. Her father had been a coward who abandoned his child to protect his reputation, and her mother had died bringing her into a world that didn't want her. The young woman spent the afternoon walking the dusty streets of Redemption Ridge, trying to reconcile the fragments of her past with the reality of her present. As evening approached, she found herself drawn back to the cemetery, to the grave that bore her mother's name and the promise of truth that Elena's letter still held. Standing once again before Hope Annabelle Carter's headstone, she unfolded Elena's letter completely for the first time. The pages were yellowed with age, and the ink had faded in places, but the words were still legible in the dying light of day. She began to read aloud again, picking up where she had left off the day before. "I have kept this secret for 20 years, Elena's letter continued. "But you deserve to know that your father did try to see you once. 3 months after your birth, William Hutchinson came to my cabin. He had written you a letter, but he could not bring himself to stay. He left the letter with me and rode away forever." The young woman's heart raced as she read these words. Somewhere there was another letter, a message from the father who had abandoned her. Elena's letter went on to explain that she had hidden William's letter inside the wooden cross itself, carving out a secret compartment to protect the words he had been too afraid to speak aloud. With trembling fingers, the young woman examined the wooden cross around her neck. She had carried it for a month without knowing it contained her father's final message. Running her fingers along its surface, she found a tiny seam where the wood had been carefully joined together. Her heart pounded as she worked at the hidden clasp. The secret compartment opened with a soft click, revealing a folded piece of paper no larger than her palm. The paper was pristine, protected from age and weather by its wooden sanctuary. She unfolded it with the reverence of someone handling a sacred relic, knowing that these might be the only words her father ever intended for her to read. "My dearest daughter," the letter began in handwriting that was bold and clear. "I am a coward and a fool, but I am not heartless. I cannot give you my name or my presence, but I can give you these words and the knowledge that you were conceived in love, even if that love was selfish and wrong." The young woman sank to her knees beside her mother's grave, reading her father's letter by the last light of the setting sun. His words spoke of regret and shame, but also of a love he felt for both her and her mother that he was too weak to honor. He wrote of watching her from a distance during her first months of life, memorizing her face before disappearing forever. "I have established a trust fund in your name," the letter continued, "managed by Judge Marcus Carter, your grandfather. When you come of age, you will have the means to build whatever life you choose. I pray that you will choose better than I did, and that you will find happiness in a world that has already failed you in so many ways." Father Miguel had followed her to the cemetery, concerned about her well-being after their difficult conversation. He approached quietly and saw her kneeling beside the grave, tears streaming down her face as she clutched 2 letters to her chest. The wooden cross lay open beside her, its secret finally revealed. The priest knelt beside her and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Child," he said softly, "what have you found?" She handed him her father's letter without speaking, and as he read the words by lamplight, his expression changed from concern to amazement. The revelation about Judge Carter added another layer of complexity to an already tangled web of secrets. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the young woman finally understood why Eleanor had taken her away from Redemption Ridge. She was not just the illegitimate daughter of a coward, she was the granddaughter of the most powerful man in the territory, a man who might have used her existence to destroy her father's reputation and family. Elena had saved her from becoming a pawn in adult games of power and revenge. Morning brought Sheriff McKenna to the young woman's room at the town's only boarding house. His weathered face was grim, and he carried official-looking papers that rustled in the desert breeze. "Miss," he said carefully, "I've been in contact with the territorial courthouse. Judge Marcus Carter died 8 years ago, but his estate is still being managed by his law firm in Phoenix." The young woman sat on the edge of her narrow bed, still wearing the dress she had worn for days of travel and revelation. Eleanor's letter lay open beside her, and her father's letter remained clutched in her hand like a talisman. "What does that mean for me?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would change everything once again. McKenna shifted uncomfortably, his boots creaking against the wooden floor. "It means you're one of the wealthiest women in the Arizona Territory," he said bluntly. "Judge Carter left specific instructions about a trust fund established by an anonymous benefactor. He was waiting for someone to come forward with proof of their identity, specifically someone carrying both a letter from Elena Vasquez and a wooden cross carved by Hope Annabelle Carter herself." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Hope had carved the cross that now lay broken on the bed, its secret compartment empty. Her mother had created the very key that would unlock her father's legacy, as if she had somehow foreseen the complex web of circumstances that would lead to this moment. Father Miguel appeared in the doorway, having been summoned by the sheriff. His face was pale, but there was something like relief in his eyes. "I remember now," he said quietly. "Hope was always carving things from wood. Crosses, flowers, little animals. She made that cross while she was pregnant with you and said it was for her daughter's protection." The young woman stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dusty street where people were beginning to go about their morning business. "All this time," she said slowly, "Elena knew. She knew about the trust fund, about my grandfather, about everything. She kept me poor and hidden for 20 years when I could have lived as a wealthy woman." Sheriff McKenna cleared his throat. "Miss, Eleanor did what she thought was best. Judge Carter was not a forgiving man, and there were those who would have used you to hurt your father's reputation. Elena protected you from being used as a weapon in other people's wars. The implications of her newfound wealth were staggering. She could leave Redemption Ridge immediately, travel anywhere in the world, and live a life of comfort and privilege that she had never imagined possible. But as she looked down at the letters in her hands, she realized that money could not fill the emptiness where her identity should be. Ruby Martinez appeared in the hallway behind Father Miguel, her silver hair gleaming in the morning light. "Girl," she said in her direct way, "you need to know something else. Elena wasn't just protecting you from your grandfather's anger. She was protecting you from something worse, from the knowledge of what this town did to your mother." The young woman turned from the window, her heart racing once again. Every answer seemed to lead to more questions, and she was beginning to understand that the truth about her past was far more complex than she had imagined. "What do you mean?" she asked, though she feared the answer would shatter what little peace she had found. Ruby stepped into the room, her eyes hard with old anger. "Hope didn't die from complications in childbirth," she said flatly. "She died because this town's so-called decent people drove her to despair. They shunned her, called her names, and made her life a misery because she loved the wrong man. Elena took you away because she knew that same hatred would eventually turn on you." The young woman felt the walls closing in around her once again. She was not just the abandoned daughter of a coward and the granddaughter of a powerful judge. She was the survivor of a tragedy that an entire community had conspired to forget. Eleanor had not just saved her from poverty or political manipulation. She had saved her from the same cruelty that had killed her mother. Word of the young woman's true identity spread through Redemption Ridge like wildfire in dry grass. By afternoon, women began arriving at the boarding house. Not the prominent wives who attended church socials, but the working women, the widows, the ones who scrubbed floors and took in laundry, and knew what it meant to survive on the margins of society. They came bearing gifts that spoke of sacrifice: a hand-sewn dress from the seamstress who could barely afford thread, fresh bread from the baker's widow who often went hungry herself, and wildflowers picked from the desert by children whose mothers remembered Elena Vasquez with fondness rather than judgment. Mrs. Sarah Mendez, who cleaned houses for the wealthy families, was the first to speak. She stood in the boarding house parlor, her work-worn hands clasped before her, and addressed the young woman with quiet dignity. "Miss, Elena was good to us. When my husband died in the mine, she helped me feed my children. She never judged, never looked down on us." One by one, the women shared their memories of Elena Vasquez, not the saloon girl that the respectable citizens whispered about, but the woman who nursed the sick, who shared her meager earnings with those who had even less, and who stood up to men who thought they could take advantage of women without protection or position. Old Mary Santos, bent with arthritis but strong in spirit, shuffled forward with tears in her eyes. "Your mother, Elena," she said in heavily accented English. "She saved my granddaughter from the men who hurt girls. She gives her money to go to her family in California. Elena, she has the heart of an angel." The young woman listened to each testimony with growing amazement. The woman who had raised her, whom she had known as quiet and reserved, had been a force of protection and compassion in this harsh desert town. Elena had hidden not just her own heroism, but also her courage in standing against the cruelty of those who claimed moral superiority. Mrs. Whitfield appeared in the doorway, her face pinched with disapproval, but the working women turned toward her with a unified expression of defiance that made her step back. Ruby Martinez stood up slowly, her silver hair catching the afternoon light like armor. "Eleanor," she said coldly, "unless you've come to add your own testimony about Elena's kindness, you're not welcome here." The confrontation that followed revealed the deep divisions that had always existed in Redemption Ridge. Mrs. Whitfield and her circle of influential women had spent 15 years maintaining their version of events, that Hope Annabelle Carter had brought shame upon herself, and that Elena Vasquez had been little better than a thief for taking the unwanted child away. But the working women told a different story. They spoke of Hope's gentle nature and artistic talents, of how she had been abandoned, not just by her lover, but by the community that should have supported her. They described Elena's desperate attempt to save the infant from a town that saw her as a symbol of inconvenient truth rather than innocent life. As the afternoon wore on, the young woman began to understand that her arrival had reopened wounds that had never properly healed. The guilt and shame that the town's leaders had tried to bury with Hope Annabelle Carter was surfacing again, embodied in her very existence. She was living proof of their failure of compassion. The revelation that struck her most deeply came from Catherine Rodriguez, who had been barely more than a child when Elena left Redemption Ridge. "Miss," Carmen said shyly, "Elena, she came to my family before she left. She cries and says she'll take you somewhere safe, somewhere you can grow up without the poison of this place in your heart." Standing in that parlor surrounded by women who had loved Elena Vasquez, despite the judgment of others, the young woman finally understood the full magnitude of her guardian's sacrifice. Elena had given up everything she knew to ensure that a baby could grow up free from the hatred that had killed her mother. Love had triumphed over fear, compassion over conformity. The next morning, the young woman stood before Hope Annabelle Carter's grave once more, but this time she was not alone. Father Miguel stood beside her, along with Ruby Martinez and a dozen of the working women who had testified to Elena's character. In her hands, she held both letters and a document that Sheriff McKenna had helped her prepare. "My name," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the cemetery, "is Eleanor Hope Carter. I take my first name from the woman who raised me with love and sacrifice, my middle name from the mother who died bringing me into this world, and my surname from the family line that connects me to this place." Father Miguel nodded solemnly and opened his leather-bound journal to a fresh page. "Elena Hope Carter," he repeated as he wrote, "born in Redemption Ridge, Arizona Territory, in the winter of 1872, daughter of Hope Annabelle Carter and William Hutchinson, raised by Elena Vasquez, until her guardian's death in 1887. The simple act of naming herself felt like claiming her entire existence. She was no longer the girl without a name, no longer a mystery to be solved or a secret to be hidden. She was Eleanor Hope Carter, and she belonged to this place as much as it belonged to her, regardless of who might wish otherwise. Ruby Martinez stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on Elena's shoulder. "Child," she said warmly, "Elena Vasquez would be proud to know you chose to carry her name. She loved you more than life itself, and she raised you to be strong enough to face whatever truth you might find." Sheriff McKenna approached with additional papers from his saddlebags. "Miss Carter," he said formally, "I have documents here from Judge Carter's estate. As his acknowledged granddaughter, you inherit not just the trust fund established by your father, but also a portion of the judge's own holdings. That includes property right here in Redemption Ridge." Elena looked around at the faces of the women who had welcomed her, at the grave of the mother she would never know, and at the wooden cross that had carried her father's letter across 20 years of secrecy. "I want to use my inheritance to help the women of this town," she said firmly. "Elena taught me that love is not something you hoard, it's something you share." The announcement sent ripples of shock through the assembled group. With her newfound wealth, Elena could live anywhere in the world, but she was choosing to stay in the place that had rejected her mother and forced her guardian to flee. More than that, she was choosing to use her resources to support the very women whom society had pushed to its margins. Father Miguel smiled as he finished writing in his journal. "Your guardian chose well when she named you Hope," he said softly. "You're bringing something to this town that it has needed for 15 years, the possibility of redemption." The irony was not lost on anyone present that Redemption Ridge might finally live up to its name. Mrs. Whitfield and several other prominent women had gathered at the cemetery gate, drawn by curiosity and alarm at the commotion. They watched from a distance as Elena officially claimed her identity and inheritance, their faces reflecting the growing realization that the balance of power in their small town was about to shift dramatically. Elena noticed their presence, but did not acknowledge them directly. Instead, she knelt beside her mother's grave and placed both letters on the headstone. "Mama," she whispered, "I don't know if you can hear me, but I want you to know that your daughter survived. Elena Vasquez kept her promise, and now I'm going to keep mine." As she stood up, Elena felt something she had never experienced before. The solid certainty of knowing exactly who she was and where she belonged. She was no longer searching for her identity. She was ready to use it to heal the wounds that had festered in Redemption Ridge for too long. 6 months after Elena Hope Carter claimed her name and inheritance, Redemption Ridge had begun to transform, in ways both subtle and profound. The large house that had belonged to Judge Carter became a refuge for women who needed shelter, medical care, or simply a place to gather without judgment. Eleanor had named it Hope House, House of Hope. The working women who had testified to Eleanor's character now met weekly in the parlor where they had first shared their memories of Elena Vasquez. These gatherings became a source of strength and solidarity, as women who had always struggled alone discovered the power of community and mutual support. Eleanor stood before the assembled women on a warm spring evening, her auburn hair now styled more elegantly, but her manner as approachable as ever. In her hands, she held the 2 letters that had brought her to Redemption Ridge, Elena Vasquez's confession and William Hutchinson's apology. They had become symbols of truth finally spoken and courage finally found. "Sisters," Elena said, using the term that had evolved naturally among the women of Hope House, "we have built something here that our mothers could only dream of, a place where women's voices matter, where our stories are heard and believed, and where we support each other instead of competing for the approval of those who would diminish us." Catherine Rodriguez, now one of Elena's closest friends and advisors, stood up to address the group. "Elena," she said with emotion, "you have given us more than shelter and support. You have given us the courage to speak our own truths, to stop hiding from the shame that was never ours to carry." The transformation had not been without resistance. Mrs. Whitfield and her circle of influential women had initially opposed Hope House, viewing it as a threat to the established social order. But as months passed and the positive effects became undeniable, even some of the prominent families began to quietly seek Elena's help with their own family troubles. Father Miguel had become one of Elena's strongest allies, using his pulpit to preach about compassion and redemption rather than judgment and condemnation. The chapel had seen an increase in attendance, particularly among women who had previously felt unwelcome in traditional religious spaces. A knock at the door interrupted the evening's gathering. Eleanor opened it to find Mrs. Whitfield standing on the porch, her usual rigid posture softened by what looked like years of suppressed emotion. Behind her stood her daughter Margaret, a young woman whose eyes held the haunted look of someone carrying burdens too heavy for her age. "Miss Carter," Mrs. Whitfield said formally, we need to speak with you about Margaret." The admission seemed to cost her greatly, but she continued. She's in the same situation your mother was in 15 years ago. I don't know. Where else to turn? Elena stepped aside to welcome them in, understanding immediately that this moment represented more than just a request for help. Mrs. Whitfield, who had spent 15 years maintaining the fiction that Hope Annabel Carter had brought shame upon herself, was now acknowledging that any woman could find herself in need of compassion and support. The gathering that followed became a turning point for the entire community. As Margaret shared her story with the assembled women, and as Mrs. Whitfield finally expressed the fear and shame that had driven her harsh judgments, the artificial divisions that had separated the women of Redemption Ridge began to crumble. Ruby Martinez, whose own past included struggles that the respectable women had always whispered about, stood up and embraced Mrs. Whitfield with genuine warmth. "Eleanor," she said simply, "we're all just women trying to survive in a world that makes it hard for us to help each other. But that doesn't mean we have to keep making it harder." As the evening progressed, Eleanor realized that her journey to Redemption Ridge had come full circle. She had arrived as a nameless young woman carrying letters from the past, and she had become the voice that allowed other women to write their own stories of survival, redemption, and hope. The wooden cross that had carried her father's letter now hung in the main parlor of Hope House, no longer a keeper of secrets, but a symbol of truth revealed and healing begun. Beside it hung a simple sign that Elena had painted herself. Every woman has a story worth hearing. Every story has the power to heal. Standing in that room full of women who had found their voices and their strength, Eleanor Hope Carter understood that her guardian, Eleanor Vasquez, had given her something even more valuable than life itself. She had given her the tools to build a community where no woman would ever again have to face her struggles alone. The letter had brought her home, but love had built her a family. 2 years had passed since Elena Hope Carter established Casa Esperanza, and Redemption Ridge had become known throughout the Arizona Territory as a beacon of hope for women in distress. The transformation was so complete that territorial newspapers began writing about the miracle of Redemption Ridge, though Elena herself preferred to think of it simply as women finally supporting each other as they should have all along. The morning mail brought an unexpected visitor in the form of a well-dressed gentleman from back east. Jonathan Whitman stepped down from the stagecoach with the careful movements of someone unaccustomed to desert travel, his fine clothes already showing the dust that seemed to coat everything in the territory. In his leather satchel, he carried documents that would once again change Elena's understanding of her family's history. Sheriff McKenna approached the stranger with the cautious courtesy he showed all newcomers. "Welcome to Redemption Ridge. Sir, name's Thomas McKenna, and I'm the law here. Might I ask what brings you to our town?" His tone was friendly but alert, a lawman's habit that served him well in distinguishing between those who came seeking help and those who brought trouble. Jonathan Whitman removed his hat and wiped the sweat from his brow with a silk handkerchief. "I'm looking for a woman named Eleanor Hope Carter," he said, his Eastern accent marking him as clearly as if he wore a sign. "I represent the Hutchinson family interests, and I have information that she needs to hear regarding her father's estate." The words caused a ripple of tension through the small crowd that had gathered to watch the stage's arrival. Elena's father, William Hutchinson, had been a painful chapter in the town's history, and most residents had assumed that his connection to their community had died with him years ago. The idea that his ghost was returning in the form of legal documents filled them with unease. Elena emerged from Casa Esperanza, having heard the commotion from her office, where she had been reviewing applications from women seeking shelter. She wore a simple blue dress that complemented her auburn hair and carried herself with the quiet confidence that had developed during her years of leadership. The wooden cross still hung around her neck, though it no longer carried secrets, only memories. "I'm Elena Hope Carter," she said, extending her hand to the stranger with the directness that had become her trademark. "I understand you have business with me regarding my father." Her voice carried no particular emotion, but those who knew her well could detect the slight tension that always appeared when William Hutchinson's name was mentioned. Jonathan Whitman's expression softened as he studied her face, and Elena noticed that his eyes held a familiarity that made her uncomfortable. "Miss Carter," he said gently, "I'm your half-brother." Our father had a legitimate family back in Philadelphia, and when he died last year, we discovered the truth about his time in the Arizona Territory. The revelation hit Elena like a physical blow, and she felt Ruby Martinez move protectively to her side. The idea that she had siblings, legitimate siblings who had grown up with their father's name and presence, opened wounds she thought had healed. For a moment, the confident woman she had become disappeared, replaced by the lost girl who had arrived in Redemption Ridge with nothing but questions. Father Miguel approached the group, his intuitive understanding of human nature, telling him that Elena would need spiritual support for whatever news this stranger brought. Perhaps, he suggested diplomatically, this conversation would be better conducted in private. Miss Carter, would you like to use the chapel? It's a place where difficult truths have been spoken before. The small procession that moved toward the chapel included Eleanor, Jonathan, Ruby, Father Miguel, and Sheriff McKenna. The townspeople watched them go with a mixture of curiosity and concern, understanding that their beloved Elena was about to face another test of the strength she had built from the ashes of abandonment and rejection. Inside the chapel's cool interior, Jonathan Whitman opened his leather satchel and withdrew a stack of documents that represented 15 years of careful investigation by the Hutchinson family lawyers. His hands shook slightly as he arranged the papers on the wooden pew, and Elena noticed that he seemed as emotionally affected by this meeting as she was. After our father died, Jonathan began, his voice thick with emotion, we found a locked box in his study. Inside were copies of every letter he had ever written to you, Miss Carter. Dozens of them, written over the years, but never sent. He had been following your life from a distance, through private investigators and carefully placed informants. Elena felt her legs grow weak and sank onto the pew beside the papers. The idea that her father had been watching her, caring about her welfare while remaining absent from her life, was almost too complex to process. She had spent years accepting his abandonment as complete, and now she was learning that his neglect had been accompanied by a secret, tortured love. Ruby Martinez sat down on Elena's other side and took her hand. Honey, she said softly, whatever. Those papers say, it doesn't change who you are or what you've accomplished. You built your strength without him, and that strength belongs to you alone. Her words carried the wisdom of someone who had also survived abandonment and emerged stronger. Jonathan continued with visible difficulty. Our father left detailed instructions about what should happen if you were ever located. He established a much larger trust than you've already accessed, enough to fund Casa Esperanza and similar institutions throughout the territory. But more than that, he wanted you to know that his absence was never about shame of you, but about protecting his legitimate family from scandal. The explanation felt like salt in an old wound. Eleanor understood the social realities that had driven her father's choices, but understanding did not equal forgiveness. He protected his legitimate family, she said quietly. But what about protecting me? What about the mother who died alone and the child who grew up believing she was unwanted? Father Miguel cleared his throat gently. Elena, he said, I think there's more that Mr. Whitman needs to tell you. I can see it in his face. The priest's years of hearing confessions had given him an ability to read the burden of unspoken truth in people's expressions. Jonathan nodded gratefully at the priest's perceptiveness. There is more, he admitted. Our father didn't just die last year, he killed himself. He left a letter explaining that the guilt of abandoning you had poisoned every day of his life since 1872. He couldn't live with the knowledge that his cowardice had cost an innocent child her birthright. The silence that followed was profound and painful. Elena stared at the papers scattered on the pew, seeing them now not as documents of inheritance, but as artifacts of a tragedy that had consumed 2 generations. Her father's suicide added another layer of complexity to her feelings about him. She could not hate a man who had suffered so deeply for his failures, but neither could she easily forgive them. Sheriff McKenna, who had remained quietly vigilant throughout the conversation, stepped forward. Mr. Whitman, he said carefully, what exactly does your family want from Miss Carter? Are you here to make amends, or is there something else? His lawman's instincts told him that there were still secrets hidden beneath this painful revelation. Jonathan looked directly at Elena for the first time since beginning his story. My sisters and I want to know you, he said simply. "We want you to be part of our family, if you'll have us. We know it's too late to give you the childhood you deserved, but it's not too late to give you the siblings you never knew you had." Elena felt tears she had not expected flowing down her cheeks. The orphan child inside her wanted desperately to accept this offer of belonging, but the strong woman she had become was wary of opening her heart to more potential disappointment. She looked around the chapel that had become a sanctuary for so many difficult conversations, seeking wisdom in its simple, sacred space. "I need time," she said finally, her voice steady despite her tears. "This is a lot to process, and I've learned not to make important decisions when my emotions are running high. Can you stay in Redemption Ridge for a few days while I think about what this means?" Her request was reasonable, but Jonathan could hear the deeper question. Could she trust this new family not to abandon her as her father had? Jonathan Whitman took a room at the boarding house and spent the next 3 days observing life in Redemption Ridge, with the careful attention of someone trying to understand his newly discovered sister. He watched Elena move through her daily routines at Casa Esperanza, noting the way women sought her counsel and the gentle authority with which she guided the community she had built. On his second evening in town, Elena invited him to join her for supper at Casa Esperanza. The dining room was filled with women of all ages and circumstances. Some were temporary residents seeking shelter, others were permanent staff members, and still others were community members who had simply come for companionship and conversation. As they ate together, Jonathan began to share stories of their father's later years. "He kept a portrait of your mother in his study," he said quietly. "It was painted from a photograph, and he would stare at it for hours. Our mother, his wife, knew about it and about you. She was actually the one who suggested we try to find you after he died." Eleanor looked up from her plate in surprise. "His wife knew about me, and she wanted you to find me." The idea that the woman she had always seen as her rival for her father's affection had actually supported the search for her was difficult to process. Jonathan nodded, understanding her confusion. Mother always said that a man who could abandon his child was a man who would carry poison in his heart forever. She believed that finding you and making amends was the only way our family could truly heal from the damage his secret had caused all of us. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Margaret Whitfield, Mrs. Whitfield's daughter, who had become one of Casa Esperanza's most dedicated volunteers after her own crisis had been resolved. She carried her infant son, born healthy and accepted with love despite the circumstances of his conception, and her face glowed with the happiness of a woman who had found her place in the world. "Elena," Margaret said warmly, "I hope I'm not interrupting, but I wanted to thank you again for everything you've done for us. My mother sent these flowers from her garden as a gesture of gratitude." She placed a beautiful bouquet of desert wildflowers on the table between Elena and Jonathan. Jonathan watched this interaction with growing understanding of who his sister had become. Elena had not simply inherited wealth and used it philanthropically. She had created a genuine community of mutual support and healing. The transformation of Margaret Whitfield from frightened unwed mother to confident volunteer spoke to Elena's ability to see potential where others saw only problems. After Margaret left, Eleanor turned back to Jonathan with a question that had been forming in her mind. "Tell me about our sisters," she said. "What are they like? Do they know about me?" The hunger for family connection was evident in her voice, despite her efforts to remain cautious. Jonathan's face lit up as he began describing Catherine and Mary Hutchinson. Catherine is a teacher in Philadelphia, unmarried by choice because she's devoted to education reform. Mary is married with 3 children, and she runs a shelter for orphans. When we told them about you, they both said the same thing, that they always felt like someone was missing from our family. The parallel between Elena's work and that of her sisters was too obvious to ignore. All 3 women had been drawn to helping others, particularly those whom society had marginalized or forgotten. Eleanor wondered if this shared calling was coincidence, or if their father's guilt had somehow influenced all of his children to seek redemption through service. As the evening progressed, Eleanor found herself warming to this brother she had never known existed. Jonathan had inherited their father's business sense, but seemed to have escaped the moral cowardice that had defined William Hutchinson's relationship with her and her mother. He spoke with genuine remorse about the privileges he had enjoyed, while she struggled to find her place in the world. "I want you to know," Jonathan said as they walked through the garden behind Casa Esperanza, "that we're not trying to ease our own guilt by including you in the family now. We genuinely want to know you, to learn from the strength you've built, and to support the work you're doing here." Elena stopped beside the wooden cross that marked the small memorial garden she had created for Elena Vasquez. "My guardian taught me that family isn't just about blood," she said thoughtfully. "It's about people who choose to love you and support you, even when it's difficult. The women here at Casa Esperanza are my family in every way that matters." Jonathan nodded, understanding that he was being tested. "Then we'll have to prove ourselves worthy of being included in that definition of family," he said simply. "We can't undo the past, but we can try to build a future together if you'll let us." Elena spent a sleepless night walking through Redemption Ridge, revisiting all the places that had become significant in her journey, from nameless orphan to community leader. She stood for a long time at her mother's grave, holding a conversation with Hope, Annabelle Carter, that no one else could hear, but that felt as real as any exchange she had ever had with the living. The next morning, she sat down at her desk in Casa Esperanza and began writing the most important letter of her life. It was addressed to Catherine and Mary Hutchinson in Philadelphia, and it represented her first direct communication with the siblings she had never known existed. "Dear sisters," she began, the word feeling both foreign and wonderful on the page, "I am writing to you from a place called Redemption Ridge, where I have spent the last 3 years learning that family is something you build as much as something you inherit. Your brother Jonathan has told me about you, and I find myself hoping that we might build something together that our father was too afraid to create." She wrote about her childhood with Elena Vasquez, describing the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise an abandoned child with love and dignity. She wrote about discovering her true identity and inheriting wealth that she had used to help other women who faced the same kinds of challenges her mother had endured. "I cannot pretend that learning about my father's other family doesn't stir up complicated emotions," she continued. "There is joy in discovering that I have sisters, but there is also pain in knowing that while I was growing up feeling unwanted, you were experiencing the love of a father I never knew. I hope you can understand both feelings and help me navigate them." Elena described Casa Esperanza and the work she was doing, but she also wrote about her fears and uncertainties. "I have spent my entire adult life believing that I was completely alone in the world, and now I'm learning that I have family who might want to know me. It's wonderful and terrifying at the same time." As she wrote, Elena realized that she was doing something her father had never been able to do. She was choosing courage over fear, connection over isolation. The letter represented a risk, but it was a risk worth taking if it meant she might gain the sisters she had always wished for. Jonathan found her in the garden that afternoon, the completed letter in her hands. "I've written to Catherine and Mary," she said, offering him the envelope. "Will you take this to them? And will you tell them that I hope they'll write back? I want to know everything about them, their favorite books, their childhood memories, their dreams for the future." That evening, Elena called a meeting of all the women associated with Casa Esperanza. She wanted to share her news with the community that had become her chosen family, and to ask for their wisdom about how to navigate this new chapter of her life. Ruby Martinez spoke first, her silver hair gleaming in the lamplight. "Elena, honey, we all know you've got a heart big enough to love both your old family and your new one. Don't let fear make you choose between them. There's room for everyone in a heart like yours." Catherine Rodriguez raised her hand shyly. "Miss Elena, my grandmother always said that when God gives you a gift, you should say thank you and figure out how to use it to help others. Maybe having sisters is a gift that will help you help even more people." Mrs. Whitfield, who had become one of Elena's most unexpected allies, offered a different perspective. "My dear," she said thoughtfully, "I spent years letting fear and pride keep me from accepting help when I needed it most. Don't make the same mistake with your family. Sometimes the greatest courage is in allowing yourself to be loved." As the meeting progressed, Elena realized that the women of Casa Esperanza were not threatened by her potential relationship with her Eastern siblings. Instead, they were encouraging her to embrace the possibility of expanded love and support. Their generosity humbled her and strengthened her resolve to take the risk of reaching out to Catherine and Mary. The letter was sent on the next stagecoach, beginning a correspondence that would transform Elena's understanding of family and belonging. As she watched Jonathan depart with promises to return soon with his sisters, Elena felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation that reminded her of the emotions she had experienced when first arriving in Redemption Ridge with Elena Vasquez's letter. 6 weeks later, 2 elegantly dressed women stepped down from the stagecoach in Redemption Ridge, their Eastern attire marking them as clearly as their nervous expressions revealed their uncertainty about this reunion with a sister they had never met. Catherine Hutchinson, tall and serious with dark hair pulled back severely, looked around the dusty streets with the analytical gaze of an educator assessing a new challenge. Mary Hutchinson Patterson, smaller and softer than her sister, held a carpetbag containing gifts for the nieces and nephews she hoped to meet, Elena's chosen family at Casa Esperanza. Her warm brown eyes searched the small crowd that had gathered to meet the stage, looking for the face that might resemble their father or their own features. Elena had spent the morning in a state of nervous energy, changing clothes 3 times, before settling on a simple green dress that complemented her auburn hair. She carried herself with the poise that had developed during her years of leadership, but those who knew her well could see the vulnerable young woman beneath the confident exterior. The moment of recognition was immediate and profound. Despite growing up in different worlds, the 3 sisters shared enough physical similarities that their relationship was unmistakable. They had the same shade of hair, the same determined, set to their chins, and the same intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything around them with careful assessment. Catherine stepped forward first, her teacher's training helping her navigate the emotional complexity of the moment. "Eleanor," she said simply, extending her hands, "we're so glad to finally meet you." Her voice carried genuine warmth despite her formal manner, and Elena felt some of her nervousness begin to ease. Mary approached more impulsively, tears already streaming down her face. "Oh, my dear sister," she said, embracing Eleanor without hesitation. "I've been dreaming about this moment since we received your letter. You're even more beautiful than Jonathan described, and I can already see the strength he wrote about." The reunion attracted a crowd of townspeople who had watched Elena's journey from mysterious stranger to beloved community leader. Father Miguel blessed the 3 sisters as they stood together, and Ruby Martinez wiped tears from her eyes as she watched Elena finally receive the family acknowledgement she had always deserved. Sheriff McKenna had arranged for Catherine and Mary to stay at the boarding house, but Elena immediately invited them to take their meals at Casa Esperanza so they could meet the women who had become her chosen family. As they walked through the building together, Elena's pride in what she had accomplished was evident in every gesture and word. The tour of Casa Esperanza became an opportunity for the sisters to understand each other's work and values. Catherine was particularly interested in the literacy classes Elena had established for women who had never learned to read, while Mary was moved to tears by the nursery, where children played while their mothers attended meetings or received training. That evening, the 3 sisters sat in Elena's private sitting room, surrounded by the letters that had shaped her life. Elena Vasquez's confession, William Hutchinson's apology, and now the correspondence that had brought them together. They talked until dawn, sharing stories of their childhoods and discovering both differences and remarkable similarities in their experiences. Catherine revealed that she had always felt driven to help underprivileged children because she sensed that her own family was incomplete. "I kept thinking there was someone missing," she said thoughtfully, "someone who needed help that I wasn't providing. Now I understand that I was feeling your absence, even though I didn't know you existed." Mary spoke about her work with orphans and her growing certainty that children needed not just shelter and food, but also the knowledge that they were valued and loved. "When I read your letter describing Elena Vasquez," she said, "I recognized a kindred spirit. She gave you what every child deserves, unconditional love and the belief that you matter." As the sun rose over Redemption Ridge, Elena realized that her sisters understood both her journey and her mission in ways that validated everything she had built. They were not trying to rescue her from her desert life or convince her to return east with them. Instead, they were asking how they could support and expand the work she was already doing. The visit from Catherine and Mary transformed into an extended stay as the three sisters began planning an ambitious expansion of Casa Esperanza's mission. Catherine's experience in education and Mary's knowledge of child welfare, combined with Elena's understanding of Western frontier, needs to create a comprehensive vision for helping women and families throughout the territory. They established the Hutchinson Sisters Foundation, using the combined resources of their father's estate and the fund Elena had already inherited. The foundation would support similar refugees in towns throughout Arizona and New Mexico, providing not just shelter, but also education, job training, and legal assistance for women who found themselves abandoned or abused. Elena insisted that Elena Vasquez's name be prominently featured in all the foundation's work. She was the first to show me that love is stronger than fear, Elena explained to her sisters. Every woman we help needs to know that someone before her chose courage over convenience, compassion over conformity. The three sisters developed a system of correspondence that would allow them to coordinate their efforts across vast distances. Catherine would establish teacher training programs in eastern cities, preparing educators to work in frontier conditions. Mary would develop adoption and family services, ensuring that children who lost their parents would find loving homes rather than institutional care. Elena would continue to lead the Western operations, but now with the security of knowing that her work was part of a larger network of support. The isolation that had characterized her early years in Redemption Ridge was replaced by the knowledge that her sisters were partners in building something that could outlast any individual life. The townspeople of Redemption Ridge watched this collaboration with amazement and pride. Their Elena had not only found her family, but had also created something that would benefit women far beyond their small desert community. The transformation of their town from a place that drove away unwed mothers to one that attracted national attention for its compassionate approach to social problems was complete. Ruby Martinez was appointed as the local coordinator for the foundation's work, recognizing her decades of experience in supporting women who found themselves on society's margins. Her silver hair had become a symbol of wisdom and resilience, and her straightforward manner helped newly arrived women understand that they were entering a place of genuine sanctuary. Father Miguel worked with the sisters to develop a spiritual component to their programs that respected diverse religious backgrounds while providing comfort to women who had been rejected by traditional religious communities. His chapel became a model for inclusive worship that other frontier communities began to adopt. Sheriff McKenna found his role evolving as well, as Redemption Ridge became known as a place where women could find legal protection from abusive husbands or predatory employers. His office began receiving visits from lawmen in other towns who wanted to learn how to better protect the women in their communities. The success of the Foundation's work attracted attention from territorial and national newspapers, which began writing feature stories about the Hutchinson Sisters miracle. Elena granted interviews reluctantly, preferring to let the women they helped tell their own stories, rather than becoming a celebrity herself. As autumn arrived in Redemption Ridge, Catherine and Mary prepared to return east to begin establishing the Foundation's operations there. The parting was emotional but not final. They had planned a rotation system that would bring them together regularly to coordinate their work and maintain the family bonds they had finally been able to build. 5 years after Eleanor Hope Carter first arrived in Redemption Ridge carrying nothing but a letter and a wooden cross, she stood once again at her mother's grave. But this time she was not alone, and she was not seeking answers. She was offering gratitude for a journey that had brought her everything she had never dared to hope for. Beside her stood Catherine and Mary, who had returned for the dedication of the expanded Casa Esperanza complex. The original building had grown into a campus that included dormitories, classrooms, workshops, a medical clinic, and a chapel designed by Father Miguel to welcome women of all faiths and backgrounds. The ceremony was attended by women from across the territory who had been helped by the Foundation's work, as well as officials from Washington who had come to study the Hutchinson sisters' approach to social welfare. Eleanor had become a reluctant expert on women's issues, testifying before territorial committees and corresponding with reformers across the nation. But the moment that meant the most to Elena was the arrival of an elderly Mexican woman who had traveled from Tucson specifically to attend the dedication. She approached Elena slowly, her weathered hands carrying a small wooden cross, identical to the one Elena wore around her neck. "Miss Elena," the woman said in accented English, "I am Catherine Vasquez, sister to your Elena. She wrote to me about you before she died, and I have come to see what became of the baby she loved more than her own life." The revelation that Elena Vasquez had family who remembered her brought tears to Elena's eyes. Catherine's presence provided the final piece of Elena's identity puzzle. Through her, Elena learned about Elena Vasquez's childhood in Mexico, her journey to Arizona as a young woman, and the dreams she had sacrificed to ensure that an abandoned baby could grow up surrounded by love rather than shame. "She always said you were destined for something important," Catherine told Elena, as they sat together in the memorial garden. "She said you had the heart of your mother and the strength of someone who had been tested by fire. She would be so proud to see what you have built here." The dedication ceremony included the unveiling of a statue honoring Elena Vasquez, carved from local stone and positioned so that it looked out over the entire Hope House complex. The inscription read, "Elena Vasquez, who chose love over fear and raised a daughter to heal the world." Elena's speech at the dedication focused not on her own achievements, but on the women who had supported her journey and the community that had grown around their shared commitment to helping others. She spoke about transformation being possible for individuals and entire communities when people choose compassion over judgment. "This place exists because one woman decided that an abandoned baby deserved love," Eleanor said to the assembled crowd. "It has grown because other women decided that their own pain could become a source of healing for others. And it will continue because we have learned that strength shared is strength multiplied." As the sun set over Redemption Ridge that evening, Elena walked through the complex she had built, noting the lights in windows where women were reading to their children, studying for examinations, or simply enjoying conversation with friends who understood their struggles. The transformation was complete, but the work continued. In her private office, Eleanor opened a new leather-bound journal and began writing what she intended to be a comprehensive record of the Foundation's work for future generations. But as she put pen to paper, she found herself writing instead about the power of letters to change lives, about the courage required to tell truth, and about the families that are built from choice rather than mere blood relations. "Dear reader," she began, "this is the story of what can happen when someone finds the courage to carry a letter across the desert, to speak truth in a place that prefers silence, and to build love where there was once only judgment." She paused, looking out, her window at the wooden cross that had brought her to this place. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new women seeking help, new opportunities to transform pain into purpose. But tonight, Elena Hope Carter sat in a room filled with the letters that had shaped her life, finally understanding that she had become what Elena Vasquez had always believed she could be. The girl without a name had found her identity. The abandoned daughter had built a family. The seeker had become a sanctuary for others, still searching for home. And the letter that had started it all, Elena Vasquez's confession of love written in fading ink, had grown into a legacy that would outlive them all. As Elena closed the journal and prepared for sleep, she whispered a prayer of gratitude to the two women whose names she carried. Hope Annabelle Carter had given her life, and Elena Vasquez had given her love. Together they had given her everything she needed to become who she was meant to be. Outside her window, the desert wind carried the scent of sage and the promise of another sunrise over Redemption Ridge. The town that had once driven away an unwed mother now welcomed women from across the territory who needed healing, hope, and the chance to begin again. The wooden cross Elena wore had carried her father's letter across 20 years of silence, Now it carried something even more precious, the knowledge that love, once planted, grows beyond anything its original gardeners could have imagined. Hope House would continue long after Elena was gone, a living testament to the power of one woman's courage to transform not just her own life, but the lives of countless others. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and the sound echoed across the desert like a benediction. Elena Hope Carter, the girl who had arrived with nothing but a letter and a cross, fell asleep surrounded by the family she had chosen and the community she had built, finally and completely home.